The photograph had a crease down the middle where James Holloway had folded it once, years ago, in a moment of careless grief, and he had regretted that fold every single day since. It was 1878, deep in the dry country of West Texas, and James Holloway was a man who cataloged the earth for a living. He worked for the United States Geological Survey, moving camp to camp across the bleached and broken landscape of the Permian Basin, noting the composition of rock layers, the depth of dry creek beds, the angle of mesa faces against the punishing afternoon sun. He carried a leather-bound field journal with him everywhere, thick with pencil sketches and geological notations and pressed specimens of sage and grama grass, and tucked between the last written page and the inside back cover, held there by nothing more than habit and the natural compression of the journal's spine, was a small tintype photograph of a woman named Delia Hart. She was 23 in the photograph. He knew because she had told him so in the letter that had accompanied it, the letter he had long since memorized and no longer needed to read, though he still kept it folded inside the front cover of the journal, because he was the kind of man who kept things. In the photograph, she stood straight-backed against a painted studio backdrop of a garden that did not exist anywhere in New Mexico territory, her dark hair pinned up beneath a modest hat, her eyes looking directly into the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was warmer than any neutral expression had a right to be. She had good, strong hands. He could see even in the small image, the kind of hands that belonged to a person who worked honestly and knew what work meant. He had met her exactly once, 2 years prior, in the town of Cimarron, New Mexico, where he had stopped to resupply during a survey of the Canadian River watershed. She had been working the front counter of Alderman's dry goods store, and he had come in for flour and coffee and surveying pencils, and she had helped him find everything he needed with a calm efficiency that impressed him. And when she had handed him his change, their fingers had brushed across the countertop, and that was all it had taken. He had stayed in Cimarron 4 days longer than he needed to. They had walked along the cottonwood-lined creek behind the main street twice in those 4 days, always in the decent afternoon light when other people were visible and no impropriety could be suggested, and they had talked about things that surprised him. She had told him about the plants that grew along that creek, their names and their uses, knowledge she had gathered from the Jicarilla Apache women who sometimes traded at the store, and he had told her about the layers of sedimentary rock he read like a book in every canyon face, and she had understood what he meant in a way that most people did not, because she was the kind of person who paid attention to the world around her and found it genuinely interesting. On his last evening in Cimarron, he had asked if he might write to her. She had said yes without hesitating, and that single unhesitating yes had kept him warm through 2 subsequent winters in the field. They had written for 6 months. Her letters were precise and funny and occasionally startling in their honesty, and his were longer than any letters he had previously written to anyone, because she made him want to explain himself fully. He had told her things about his work and his life in those letters that he had never spoken aloud. She had told him she hoped to eventually own her own piece of land, something small but hers, and raise horses. She had told him she had come to Cimarron from Santa Fe after her mother died of consumption, that her father had gone east before she was born, and she had no real family remaining except a distant aunt in Missouri she had never met. She had sent him the photograph in January of 1876, tucked inside a letter that said, "So you do not forget what I look like between letters," which was a kind of teasing and also a kind of earnestness that he had found devastating in the best possible way. And then in the early spring of 1876, her letters had stopped. He had written 3 times more, spacing the letters weeks apart so as not to seem frantic, though he had been quietly frantic. No answer came. He had finally written to Alderman's dry goods store directly, asking whether Miss Delia Hart was still employed there and in good health, and the reply he had received, written in a cramped hand that was clearly not Alderman's usual, informed him only that Miss Hart had left the store's employ in February, and her whereabouts were not known to the correspondent. That was 2 years ago. He had carried the photograph through every dry season since, pressed inside the field journal like a botanical specimen, like something he was preserving against future need. He was 28 years old now, and he had never stopped thinking about her, which embarrassed him somewhat when he thought about it directly, but which he accepted as simply true when he stopped thinking about it and just let himself feel it. A man could not manufacture that kind of pull from nothing. It meant something. He believed that. He was camped in the canyon country east of the Pecos River in late September of 1878 when the thing happened that changed everything. He had made camp at a bend where a seasonal creek had left a broad flat of dry sand, good ground to spread his equipment, and he had just finished his evening meal of salt pork and cornbread cooked in a small iron pan over a mesquite fire when he heard hoofbeats coming from the south. He was not alarmed immediately. The survey's work took him through territory that was crossed by various legitimate travelers, freighters and cattle drives, and the occasional line rider from one of the big ranches that had begun spreading across the basin in recent years. He stood and moved toward the edge of his firelight, which was the sensible thing to do, to let arriving strangers see him clearly and to see them clearly in return. There were 2 riders, moving fast, and a third horse behind them on a lead rope. As they came closer, he could see that the second rider was slumped badly in the saddle, clinging to the horn, and that the first rider was a woman. She pulled up hard at the edge of his firelight, and he saw her face, and every rational thought he possessed simply stopped for a long, ringing moment, like a struck bell going silent. It was Delia Hart. She was dusty, and her hat was gone, and her dark hair had mostly come down from whatever she had pinned it into that morning, and there was a look in her eyes that mixed fear and exhaustion and relief in equal parts. And she was 25 years old now, and the most beautiful sight James Holloway had ever encountered in his life. And he stood there like a complete fool for approximately 3 seconds before his brain caught up with his eyes. "I need help," she said, her voice level but with an edge under it like a blade under cloth. "My companion has been shot. It is not mortal, I believe, but the wound needs tending, and I cannot do more for him alone." James was already moving. "Get him down," he said, "carefully. I have medical supplies." The companion was an older man, perhaps 55, with a gray beard and a lined face the color of old leather, wearing the clothes of a working rancher. He had been hit in the upper left arm. The bullet apparently passed through, which was indeed not mortal provided the wound did not corrupt. He was conscious enough to help them lower him from the horse and lay him on James's bedroll, and he managed a grunt that conveyed both pain and dignity. "His name is Carver Fitch," Delia said, kneeling beside the man with a calm efficiency that James recognized from the dry goods store 2 years before. "He is the foreman of the Rocking H Ranch out of Odessa. He was helping me." "What were you doing that required this much helping?" James asked, not unkindly, as he got his medical kit open. He had clean cloth and iodine and a needle and thread, all things a field surveyor needed in country where the nearest doctor was often 2 days' ride, and he had set a few wounds before in his career, though none under quite these circumstances. "That is a longer story than you have time for right now," she said. "Fair enough," he said, and focused on the wound. Carver Fitch was stoic through the cleaning and the stitching, making only a single sharp sound when the iodine went in, and then going quiet and controlled for the rest of it. When James had done what he could do and tied off the bandage, the old foreman lay back and let out a long breath that seemed to contain considerable pain released carefully, like steam from a valve. "You are good at that," Delia said quietly, watching James pack the medical kit away. "I have had practice," he said. Then he looked at her. She was looking at him. And in the firelight, in the broad silence of the Texas canyon country, with the first stars showing above the eastern rim, 2 years of silence and wondering pressed between them like a physical thing. "Delia," he said. "James Holloway," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. I recognized your camp flag from half a mile off. The survey markers. I hoped it was you, and I told myself I was being foolish, but I kept riding toward it anyway." He did not know what to say to that, so he said the practical thing. "You should eat something, both of you. I have enough." She accepted this with a small nod, and he put the pan back on the coals. And for the next quarter hour they ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which told him something true about who they still were to each other even after 2 years and no letters and everything that had apparently happened in between. After Carver Fitch had eaten and fallen into the deep, medicinal sleep of a man whose body needed recovery more urgently than his mind needed anything else, Delia sat across the small fire from James with her coffee cup between both hands and told him what had happened. She had left Cimarron in February of 1876 because a man named Delwyn Price had made it impossible to stay. Price was a man of some local consequence, a land broker and sometime cattle speculator who had decided he wanted Delia for a wife and had not taken her polite refusals with any grace whatsoever. He had begun appearing at the store at all hours, had spoken to aldermen privately in ways that resulted in aldermen reducing her hours, and then eventually telling her, with genuine apology, that he could not continue employing her if Price was going to make things difficult for the business. She had left rather than be the cause of aldermen's ruin, which was the kind of person she was. She had moved south to Socorro, and then further south to Las Cruces, taking work where she could find it, always moving when a situation became complicated, which in those years of her life had happened more often than she would have liked. 18 months ago she had found steadier ground in Odessa, Texas. She had taken a position as the bookkeeper for a small ranching operation called the Rocking H, owned by an elderly widow named Mrs. Charlotte Harbord, who was in her 70s and sharp as a new knife despite her age. Carver Fitch was the ranch foreman and had been with Mrs. Harbord for 20 years and was loyal to her with the unsentimental devotion of a good working man. Delia had settled in there with something approaching contentment. She had her own small room in the ranch house, honest work that used her head, and horses to tend on her days off, which she loved. The trouble had started 3 months ago when a man named Cole Reardon had arrived in the Odessa basin with a crew of hard-faced men and a great deal of money, and a plan to consolidate rangeland. He had approached Mrs. Harbord about buying the Rocking H, and she had declined, politely and firmly, as was her right and entirely within her character. Reardon had not responded to this the way a legitimate businessman would have responded. Fences on the eastern boundary of the Rocking H had begun appearing cut overnight. A water tank on the south pasture had been filled with quicklime, poisoning it for the cattle. 2 of the Rocking H's younger ranch hands had been run off by men they described as belonging to Reardon's outfit, though no one could prove it in front of a sheriff, and the sheriff in Ector County was a man who had apparently been made comfortable by Reardon's money in ways that discouraged his professional interest in investigating these matters. A month ago, Mrs. Harbord had suffered a severe episode of her heart, brought on, Delia believed, by the stress of the situation. She was confined to bed, and the ranch's management had fallen entirely to Carver Fitch and Delia. They had tried to get word to the U.S. Marshal's office in Austin, but their messenger had returned with a letter that said the matter was being reviewed, which meant nothing was happening quickly. Last week Reardon's men had come to the ranch house directly and presented what they called a final offer. It was less than half the land's value, and there was nothing in the language of the offer that could be called a threat. But 2 of Reardon's men had stood on the porch with their hands near their guns the whole time the offer was being read, and that was its own kind of language. Delia and Carver Fitch had decided to ride to Midland to try to reach a legitimate lawyer and get the ranch's deed and Mrs. Harbord's documented refusals into official legal hands before anything worse happened. They had ridden out before dawn 3 days ago, taking the back route through the canyon country to avoid the roads where Reardon's men were known to patrol. 2 days out, in the broken ground north of the Picos, 3 riders had come at them from behind a limestone shelf, and Carver had been hit in the opening shot before they could run, and they had run hard and long until they were clear, and then they had ridden the rest of the day until Delia had seen the survey flag and made her decision. James listened to all of this without interrupting, which took effort, because there were several points in her story where the emotion in her voice was something he wanted very much to respond to. But he let her tell it whole, because she was telling it with a precision that said she needed to get it out completely, to set it in order, the way a person does when they have been holding a frightening thing alone for too long and finally find someone capable of listening. When she finished, he looked at her across the dying fire. "What do you need?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment that stretched. "I need to get to Midland, and I need someone who can testify to what has happened. Someone outside the situation whose word might carry weight." "A United States government surveyor's word carries some weight," he said. "I know," she said quietly. "That is why I rode toward your flag when I saw it, James. I knew it was survey camp. I did not know it was yours." "But it was," he said. "But it was," she agreed, and there was something in the simplicity of those 3 words that sat between them with its full weight, acknowledged and set carefully down. He told her he would ride with them to Midland. He had enough supplies. His survey grid could wait a week. She looked at him when he said it, and her expression was something he could not entirely parse: gratitude and relief, and something older and more complicated underneath both of those things. And he made himself look back at the fire rather than at her face, because they were 2 adults alone in the canyon country, and there were proper ways to conduct oneself, and he intended to conduct himself properly. But he thought, as he rolled out his blanket well away from hers, with old Carver between them sleeping soundly, that he had been waiting 2 years for something that he had not known would be an emergency in the Texas canyon country. And perhaps that was simply the way things went when the world was as wide and unceremonious as the country they were camped in. In the morning, Carver Fitch was feverish. Not dangerously so, not yet, but enough that the color had gone wrong in his face, and his hands were hot to the touch, and he moved with the deliberate carefulness of a man who knew that certain motions cost him more than they should. He insisted he was fine to ride, and then demonstrated the truth of the matter by needing 2 attempts to get himself onto his horse, after which he sat there looking at nothing in particular while his jaw set and his eyes went to a quiet, controlled place. "We are moving slowly today," James said, in a tone that did not invite discussion. Carver said nothing, which was its own kind of agreement. Delia had been up before both of them, James discovered, and she had already watered all 3 horses from James's camp barrel and put together a breakfast of coffee and the last of her own provisions, which were minimal enough to indicate she had been running short before she found him. He accepted his coffee from her, and she accepted his cornmeal, and this domestic exchange in the early morning light, with the canyon walls going gold and the hawks beginning their first slow circles above the mesa top, struck him as one of the most purely pleasant moments he had experienced in quite some time, which said something about the shape his life had taken in the survey years. They rode north through the morning, James on his gray gelding he called Survey for lack of any better inspiration, Delia on a paint mare that moved with a good sure-footed authority in the broken terrain, and Carver on the solid bay that had been carrying him 20 years and knew its rider's weight and rhythm by heart. James set a pace that was easy enough for a wounded man to manage without compounding the wound, and they moved through the canyon country with the kind of quiet that long riders fall into when the country demands attention and conversation can wait. It was Delia who broke the silence, perhaps 2 hours out of camp. She rode up alongside him where the trail widened and looked straight ahead and said, "I am sorry I stopped writing." James watched a red-tailed hawk descend in a long diagonal toward the canyon floor. "You do not need to apologize for surviving a difficult situation. "I should have written to explain," she said. "Even one letter. I thought about it many times. I talked myself out of it each time because I thought it would be unfair to you." "Unfair how?" he asked, genuinely curious. She was quiet for a moment. "I did not know where I was going or what I was doing or how any of it would settle. I thought if I wrote to you when I was like that, when I was unsettled and frightened and moving from place to place, I would be asking you for something I had no right to ask. You could have just told me what was happening," he said. "I would have come." She turned to look at him then, and he met her gaze because there was nothing in it he wanted to avoid. Her eyes were the color of dark river water, and they were full of something he recognized as a kind of ache, because he had been carrying its counterpart for 2 years. "That is what I was afraid of," she said quietly. He did not know exactly what to do with that, so he looked back at the trail and they rode on in silence, but it was a different silence than before. It was a silence that had been cleared of something, like air after rain. They made camp that second night at a limestone shelf where a small spring ran clean and cold from a crack in the rock face, one of those improbable gifts the dry country occasionally produced. James cleaned and redressed Carver's wound, which was looking angry at the edges but had not yet gone to true infection, and he gave the old foreman the last of his willow bark tea, which reduced the fever enough to let the man sleep without restlessness. Delia sat beside the injured man for an hour after dinner, talking to him in a low voice about things James could not hear from his position across the fire, the specific murmur of it carrying, the words not, and Carver's responses in the same register, and the quality of that exchange told James something about who Delia Hart was beyond the things he had already known. She was not performing care. She was simply giving it. At some point Carver fell asleep mid-conversation, as sick men do, and Delia came back to the fire and sat down across from James and accepted the second cup of coffee he had ready for her. "Tell me about the survey work," she said. "Tell me what you have been doing." So he told her. He told her about the geological formations of the Permian Basin, the ancient sea beds turned to stone and tilted by time, and she listened with genuine attention. He told her about a canyon he had mapped 2 weeks prior where the rock walls contained a compressed record of 100 million years, told in colored stripes, red and yellow and gray and white. And her expression went to the particular kind of interested that meant she was building the image in her mind's eye, and that expression on her face made him feel like a man who had said something worth saying. He told her about a night earlier in the summer when he had been camped alone on a high mesa, and a thunderstorm had come in from the west with a wind so cold it had felt like November and lightning that lit the whole basin up every 30 seconds for an hour, and how it had been both terrible and magnificent, and there had been no one to share it with. "That must be the hardest part," she said. "The alone of it." "It is," he said honestly. "The work itself I love, but the alone of it, yes." "That is the cost." She was looking at him steadily across the fire. "I have been alone for 2 years too," she said. "Not in the same way, but alone." "I know," he said. "I thought about your letters often," she said. "I kept them, all of them." "I kept yours," he said. She smiled, and it was the first real full smile he had seen from her since she had ridden into his camp, and it transformed her face the way dawn transforms a landscape, not by adding light exactly but by revealing what was already there waiting. "I have your photograph," he said before he had entirely decided to say it. She blinked. "You do?" "In my field journal. I have carried it through every survey since you sent it. It has a crease in it from when I folded it once, which I regret." She was quiet for a long moment. "James Holloway," she said, and her voice was very soft. "You are either the most sentimental man in Texas or the most stubborn." "Probably both," he said. She laughed, and the sound of it in the night air, against the limestone and the sage and the cold creek sound, was something he wanted to keep the way he kept pressed specimens in his journal. He wanted to press it flat and carry it with him and have it always. The next morning Carver's fever had broken, which was the kind of news that straightened a man's back and put color back in a camp's general mood. He was still weak and needed to move carefully, but the danger had passed, and he ate a full breakfast and sat up straight and told James Holloway directly that he was a competent medic and a good man, which coming from Carver Fitch was evidently high praise, judging by the way Delia raised her eyebrows and mouthed silently to James from across the fire. He never says that about anyone. They made good time that day. The country opened out of the canyon breaks into broader grassland as they moved northeast, the kind of country where you could see weather coming from 30 miles away, and the sky performed accordingly, building great white anvil clouds in the southwest that dragged gray curtains of distant rain behind them. The rain did not reach them, but the smell of it did, that mineral sweetness of water on dry ground, and James watched Delia ride ahead through it with her face turned slightly into the wind, and thought that he had been carrying a small, flat image of this woman for 2 years, and the real thing was so much more than any image could hold. In the afternoon, Delia came alongside him again and said, "When do you typically finish your survey season?" "October," he said. "I submit my reports in Austin by November 1st. And then I have 3 months before the next season begins. I usually spend it in Austin, working on the reports, planning the next grid." She nodded. She was quiet for a bit. Then she said, "Mrs. Harbord told me once that if she had her life to do again, she would do fewer sensible things and more honest ones." He looked at her. "That is interesting advice to relay." "I thought so too," she said, and rode on ahead, and he watched her go with his heart doing something complicated and warm in his chest. They reached the outskirts of Midland late on the 4th day from James's survey camp, coming in through the western approach in the long amber light of early evening. Midland in 1878 was a young town, barely 3 years old, established on the high desert plain between the Pecos River and the Colorado River drainage, as a provisioning stop for the cattle drives pushing north to the Concho River country. It had a main street with the usual establishment of such western towns: a hotel, a general store, a land office, a saloon, a barber, and a small frame building that served as both the county recorder's office and the office of the county judge. It had a telegraph line, which was the thing that mattered most to James at that moment. They took rooms at the hotel, Delia and Carver each in separate rooms on the ground floor where Carver would not have to manage stairs in his current condition. James paid for all 3 without making anything of it, because the most natural thing in the world when you were the one with a salary, and your companions had been robbed of their safety and shot at and run 3 days through the canyon country, was to pay for their rooms without comment. Delia noticed, and she said nothing about it except to look at him for a moment in a way that said she had noted the gesture and would address it properly when there was time. The next morning James went first to the telegraph office and sent a wire to the U.S. Marshal's office in Austin. He identified himself as a United States Geological Survey field agent, which was accurate, and reported the attack on the Rocking H. Foreman and the pattern of intimidation against the Harbord Ranch, and included Cole Reardon's name and the name of the compliant Ector County Sheriff, and requested that a marshal with jurisdictional authority make contact with the Harbord Ranch and the Midland County Judge with all possible speed. He had no authority to compel this, but a survey agent's report carried official weight and went into official channels, and officials in Austin had at least theoretical motivation to respond to it. Then he went with Delia to the county recorder's office, where they spent 3 hours with a dry, methodical man named Hargrove, who was exactly the kind of honest bureaucrat that a desperate situation required. Delia had the original Harbord Ranch deed in an oilskin packet she had sewn into the lining of her saddle bag, along with 3 months of correspondence documenting the incidents of fence cutting and the water poisoning and the intimidation, all dated and signed, and organized in the meticulous manner of a person who had been keeping books long enough to understand that documentation was power. Hargrove looked through it all with increasing interest and then made certified copies of everything and filed them in the county record, which meant that whatever happened to the originals, there was now an official, protected, witnessed record of the Harbord Ranch's ownership and the documented pattern of interference with it. "This is well done," Hargrove told Delia, looking at her over his reading spectacles. "Mrs. Harbord kept good records," Delia said. "I just organized them." "Miss Hart," said Hargrove, "I have been in this office 11 years, and I can tell the difference between organized records and a case built by someone who knows exactly what she is doing." Delia received this with a composure that did not entirely hide her satisfaction, and James, watching from his chair against the wall, thought that this was one of the finest things he had ever witnessed. They had lunch at the hotel dining room, all three of them, Carver Fitch eating with the replenished appetite of a man recovering well and delivering his considered opinion on the county recorder, with the authority of someone who had dealt with many officials across many years. His considered opinion was that Hargrove was a straight shooter and that the records being filed there were worth considerably more than whatever Reardon's lawyer could produce in opposition, because a straight judge read clean records as what they were. "There is still the matter of getting home," Delia said. "Mrs. Harbord is alone." "She has the other hands," Carver said. "3 of them left last month," Delia said. "You know that, Carver." The old foreman's jaw tightened. "She has the Ray's boy," he said. It was clear this was the minimum he found acceptable, which meant he was worried. "We should go back by the northern route," Delia said. "Longer, but it avoids the country where those riders came at us." James had been listening to this exchange and doing a set of calculations in his head. His survey grid for the current season was in the canyon country south and west of here, and he had perhaps 2 weeks of work remaining before he needed to begin his return to Austin anyway. The northern route to Odessa passed through country he had not yet surveyed, country that appeared on his working maps as a broad blank. He told himself this was the professionally relevant consideration. He also knew it was not the only consideration. "I will ride back with you," he said. Carver Fitch looked at him with the measured assessment of a man who has spent 50 years reading other men in the context of horses and weather and work and something else, and then nodded once, which James understood to mean something larger than simple agreement. Delia looked at him differently, with something in her eyes that made him feel the way the edge of a high mesa made him feel, the simultaneous pull of a vast space opening in front of you and the clear knowledge of where you were standing. They left Midland 2 days later, allowing Carver the time to rest and strengthen properly before a long ride, and James the time to resupply his camp stores and send a revised schedule to his survey supervisor in Austin. The night before they left, James and Delia walked out to the edge of town, where the land fell away toward the south in the long evening light, and they stood there without speaking for a while, because the desert in that light did not require anything spoken over it. Then Delia said, "Can I see it?" He looked at her. "The photograph?" "Yes." He reached into his coat and pulled out the field journal and opened it to the back and handed her the small tintype. She took it carefully and looked at it for a long moment. Her face in the evening light was very still. "I was terrified the day this was taken," she said. "Of the camera. It seemed like such a serious machine." She turned it over in her fingers and then held it back out to him. He took it and looked at it, the way he had looked at it 1,000 times, and then looked at her beside him, the living original, and felt the particular happiness of a man holding the real thing alongside the thing he had kept of it, and understanding in the body, not just the mind, the difference between the two. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you said, about Mrs. Harbord and her advice." "What about it?" she said, and her voice had a particular quality that said she knew exactly where this was going and was choosing to let him get there. "I think she was right," he said. "I have spent 2 years doing the sensible thing, which was accepting that the letters stopped and moving on, and I was not very good at the sensible thing. I kept the photograph. I kept the letters. I kept thinking about a woman I had known for 4 days and corresponded with for 6 months, and that was not sensible at all." "No," she agreed. It was not very sensible, but it was honest, he said. She was looking at him in the evening light. Yes, she said quietly, it was. He put the journal back into his coat. I am not in a position to make any sort of formal statement right now, standing on the edge of Midland, Texas, before we ride into a situation that may still require some resolving. But I want you to know that I intend to be honest rather than sensible from this point forward, as far as that applies to you. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think that is the most carefully worded declaration of intent I have ever received. I am a surveyor, he said. I measure things carefully before I commit them to the record. She laughed, and in the warm desert evening with the stars beginning to show above the flat horizon, it was the best sound in the world. And James Holloway stood there listening to it and felt the particular peace of a man who has been navigating by dead reckoning for a long time and has finally got a true bearing. The ride back to the Rocking H took 4 days. They went north first, skirting the high-cap rock country, then swung west and south through rangeland that was broad and gold in the October grass, dotted with antelope and the occasional cluster of longhorn cattle that had wandered off someone's range, wild-eyed and suspicious at the sight of riders. James took careful notes in the field journal when the terrain offered geological interest, which it did reliably, and Delia sometimes rode beside him while he made his observations and asked questions that were better than most questions he had been asked in his professional life, because they were based on actual curiosity rather than politeness. She told him more about the Rocking H during those 4 days, about Mrs. Harbert, who had come from Georgia with her husband in 1863 and built the ranch from raw country and had outlived her husband by 15 years, and had no intention of giving up what she and he had made together to a man like Cole Reardon. She told him about the horses she had been working with on her days off, a line of tough, quick-footed quarter horses Mrs. Harbert had been breeding for 20 years, and when she talked about the horses her face went to a particular alive quality that James found himself seeking the way you seek light in a dim room. On the 3rd evening, camped in a shallow draw where good grass grew, Carver Fitch went asleep early, his body still finishing its recovery with the authority of its own schedule, and James and Delia sat by the fire and talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, the way 2 people do when they have reached the point of ease with each other that does not require a destination for conversation, where talking is itself the point and the content is secondary. He told her about growing up in Virginia, the son of a surveyor father who had mapped railroad routes through the Blue Ridge Mountains and had taken young James along starting at age 10 to carry equipment and learn the work. She told him about growing up in Santa Fe, the daughter of a seamstress who had known the name of every woman in the territory who could afford a good dress, and who had given Delia a thorough and unsentimental education in the management of difficult people and difficult situations. She sounds remarkable, James said. She was the most capable person I have ever known, Delia said. And she was also funny, which people often do not expect from capable people. Do you think of her often? He asked. Every day, she said simply. But it is a good kind of thinking, the kind that still has her in it. He nodded. My father died 3 years ago, he said. I understand that kind of thinking. She looked at him with a quietness that was a kind of reaching. Are you all right? She asked, and the asking was direct and without decoration, not how do you manage, not I am sorry for your loss, but simply are you all right? And it was so precisely what anyone needed to be asked about grief that he felt something release slightly in his chest that had been tightened there for 3 years. I am, he said. I think so. Mostly. Good, she said, and that was all, and it was enough. They reached the Rocking H on the afternoon of the 4th day, coming in from the north through a gate in a cedar post fence that Carver Fitch opened, and then latched behind them with the careful habit of a man who had been responsible for this land for 20 years. The ranch house sat in a depression in the plain, where 3 mesquite trees offered the only shade for a 1/4 mile in any direction, a low adobe structure with a covered porch, and a tin roof that had been patched in several places over its long life. There were corrals behind it with a dozen horses and a small bunkhouse for the hands, and a barn, and the whole place had the look of a ranch that had been built carefully and maintained honestly, and was still working even under pressure. A young man of perhaps 20 came out of the barn when they rode in, a Mexican-American boy with quick eyes and a serious face, who Delia addressed as Miguel, and who informed them immediately that Mrs. Harbord was somewhat improved but still confined to her room, that no one from Reardon's outfit had appeared in their absence, and that 2 of the departed ranch hands had returned the previous day saying they had heard about the U.S. Marshal's office inquiry from someone in town, and had decided the situation might be less hopeless than previously estimated. "Miguel Reyes," Carver Fitch said from his horse, looking down at the young man with great seriousness, "you have done well." Miguel Reyes received this the same way Delia had received the county recorder's compliment, with a composure that only barely contained the fact that it meant a very great deal. James was introduced to Mrs. Harbord that evening, sitting in a chair by her bedroom window where the last of the afternoon light came in and turned everything amber and warm. She was a small, white-haired woman who had clearly once been quite tall, now diminished somewhat by age and recent illness, but with eyes that were sharp and direct, and surveyed him the way a person surveys something they intend to accurately assess. "A government surveyor," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Delia told me about you in her letters," Mrs. Harbord said. "The ones from before." James glanced at Delia, who was standing in the doorway and whose expression was carefully neutral. "I see," he said. "She said you were the most interesting person she had met in a considerable time," Mrs. Harbord said, with the directness of a woman who was 72 years old and had no time left to waste on indirection. "She was the most interesting person I had met in a considerable time," James said, with equal directness, because the occasion seemed to demand it. Mrs. Harbord's expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile but in the same territory. "You can have the room at the end of the hall," she told him. "Dinner is at 7. The response from Austin came 11 days later, brought by a deputy U.S. Marshal named Aldous Webb who rode into the Rocking H on a gray Thursday morning with 2 additional deputies, and a jurisdictional warrant, and the kind of air that federal authority wore in those years. Quiet and deliberate, and extremely tired of having to come all the way out here to deal with things the local law should have handled already. Marshal Webb was a compact, economical man of 40 who said very little and apparently retained everything. And he spent 2 hours with Delia and the documented records and James's official survey report before he said anything substantive at all. What he then said, substantively, was that Cole Reardon had a history of this particular kind of land-gathering operation, that he had done something similar in the country north of San Angelo the previous year, and that there was now a case being assembled at the federal level that the Rocking H documentation materially strengthened, and that Reardon and his men would be receiving visitors in the very near future. He also said that the Ector County Sheriff would be having a conversation with the appropriate oversight body about his professional conduct, delivered in a tone that suggested this conversation would not be a pleasant one. When Marshal Webb and his deputies left 2 days after arriving, Delia stood on the porch and watched them go, and then stood there a few minutes longer in the cool October air, and James came and stood beside her and they watched the dust of the departing riders settle back into the plain. "It is not entirely over," she said. "No," he said, "but it is mostly over." "Close enough," she said, and some large tension went out of her posture, a tension she had been carrying so long it had become part of how she held herself, and without it she seemed both smaller and somehow more present, more fully here and not partly somewhere else managing the weight of the thing. She turned to look at him. They were standing close on the porch in the morning light, and whatever careful distance they had been maintaining for the past 2 weeks was suddenly insufficient to the moment. "I want to say something," she said. "All right," he said. I spent 2 years believing I was protecting you from a situation that had no clear resolution, she said. By not writing, by disappearing. I told myself it was consideration for you, and in truth it was partly fear. I was afraid of needing something I was not sure I deserved. Delia, he said. Let me finish, she said, not unkindly. I was afraid that if I asked you to be part of my life when my life was that precarious, I was being selfish. And I also know that by protecting you from the difficulty, I removed any choice you had in the matter. That was not fair. I am sorry for it. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her face in the morning light, the directness of her and the courage underneath the directness. I accept the apology, he said, and I want to say something in return. All right, she said. I kept your photograph for 2 years, he said. Not because I lacked the sense to move on, but because some part of me knew that what we had in those 4 days in Cimarron and in those 6 months of letters was as real as any geological formation I have ever mapped. And those formations are real because they were built by forces that did not make small decisions. They were built by time and pressure and accumulation. And what I felt about you was like that. It was not something I manufactured. It was something that formed. She was looking at him with very bright eyes. James Holloway, she said, that is either the most romantic thing a geologist has ever said or the most geological thing a romantic has ever said. I am prepared to accept both interpretations, he said, and she laughed and stepped forward and took his hand in both of hers and held it. He did not pretend this was a casual thing. He turned his hand and held hers back, and they stood on the porch in the October morning in West Texas and let the moment be what it was, which was the beginning of something they had both been waiting for, with considerable and sometimes painful patience, for 2 very long years. The weeks that followed were good ones. Cole Reardon was arrested by federal marshals in early November, along with 3 of his men, and the charges against them were serious enough that the land consolidation operation collapsed of its own weight. The cooperative Ector County Sheriff resigned his position before he could be formally removed. The Rocking H's remaining hands returned to full strength with the addition of a young couple from the Davis Mountains, a man and his wife who needed steady work and were excellent with horses. Mrs. Harbord improved steadily through October and was on the porch in her chair by the first week of November, wrapped in a heavy shawl and supervising her recovered domain with the critical benevolence of a person who has recently been reminded that the view from this particular chair is worth fighting for. She watched James and Delia with an expression of satisfied assessment whenever they were in her line of sight, and she occasionally made remarks to Carver Fitch that were just low enough to be unintelligible at a distance, but which caused Carver to produce sounds suggesting restrained amusement. James had pushed his survey deadline to November 15th with a request to his supervisor that cited, accurately, the discovery of previously unmapped geological formations in the Cap Rock country north of Odessa. And this was true, and the notes he had taken during the 4 days of riding back to the ranch were genuinely valuable additions to the survey's understanding of that section of the basin. He wrote his preliminary notes in the evenings, at the table in the kitchen, where Delia worked on the ranch's books beside him, and they sat companionably across from each other in the lamplight, while the desert night cooled outside and the household settled around them. One evening in late October, Delia looked up from her ledger and watched him write for a moment and then said, "What will you do when the survey seasons are over? You cannot map the territory indefinitely. Eventually it will all be mapped." "That is a reasonable observation," he said. "Probably another 10 years of fieldwork in the territories if the survey continues its current program. After that, desk work or teaching or private work for mining or railroad interests." "Where would you do that?" "Wherever there was work worth doing," he said, and then he looked at her across the lamplight and said, "Or wherever there was reason to be." She held his gaze. "And is there reason to be somewhere in particular?" "I am beginning to think there is," he said. She put down her pen. "I am thinking of asking Mrs. Harbord whether I might take over the management of the horse operation," she said. "Formally, she has been wanting to expand it for 2 years but did not have the right person to run it. I have the right knowledge, and I love this land." "That sounds like exactly right work for exactly the right person," he said. "It would mean I would be here," she said, "permanently, or as permanently as anything is." "Yes," he said. "Is that information you find relevant to your plans?" She asked, with a slight curve at the corner of her mouth that was doing considerable work. "Extremely," he said, and reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was on a Sunday in early November, the day before his departure date for Austin, that James Holloway asked Delia Hart properly and directly whether she would marry him. He had thought about how to do it for 3 weeks, and he had concluded that the only appropriate approach for two people of their particular temperaments was the direct one. So he asked her in the morning on the porch, with the first real cold of the season in the air and their breath showing white, and he said it plainly and clearly and looked at her eyes the whole time. She was quiet for a moment that felt long but which he thought was actually quite short, and then she said, "Yes, I would like that very much," in a voice that was steady and warm and entirely certain, and he took her face in both his hands and kissed her for the first time properly in the November morning light on the porch of the Rocking H Ranch, and it was exactly as good as 2 years of carried photographs and kept letters had suggested it would be. Mrs. Harbord from just inside the screen door said, "Well, finally," in a tone of profound and well-earned satisfaction. Carver Fitch, somewhere behind the barn, contrived at that moment to drop something metal on the wooden floor of the tack room, producing a celebratory sort of clatter that James chose to interpret as applause. James left for Austin 3 days later than planned, which he recorded in his survey notes as delayed departure, due to continued geological assessment of the Cap Rock Formation, which was partially true, and also due to being unwilling to shorten by a single hour the time he had with Delia before the 3-month separation that stood between them and the wedding they had set for February. He rode out on a gray November morning with his survey equipment packed and the field journal in his coat, and at the gate Delia stood with her paint mare saddled beside her, because she had ridden out to the gate to see him off, and she held his horse's bridle for a moment and looked up at him. 3 months, she said. 3 months, he agreed. Write to me, she said. Every week, he said, without fail. I will write back this time, she said, with a small wry lift that acknowledged everything they had both been through to get to this particular gate on this particular morning. I know, he said, and leaned down from the saddle and kissed her once more, briefly and warmly, and then straightened and rode out through the gate and did not look back until he was a quarter-mile out. And when he looked back, she was still standing at the gate watching him go, and he raised his hand, and she raised hers, and that was how they parted, with their hands raised against the pale November sky. The 3 months in Austin were the most productive of his professional career, because a man who has a February wedding to prepare for, and a woman's letters arriving weekly with their precise, funny, honest accounts of life on the Rocking H and Mrs. Harbord's recovering health and Miguel Reyes's growing authority with the horses and Carver Fitch's dignified refusal to admit he had developed any sentimental attachment to the situation whatsoever. That man does not waste his evenings. He completed his reports and the Permian Basin survey grid to a standard his supervisor described as unusually thorough, and he began making the practical arrangements that a man in his position needed to make if he was going to take a wife and establish something more permanent than a succession of survey camps. He wrote to the survey requesting that his next season's grid be centered in the West Texas and southeastern New Mexico territories, which was both professionally logical given the incomplete mapping of that region and personally convenient in ways he did not specify in the official request. The request was approved in January. He also wrote to a friend of his father's who was a judge in Austin, asking about the legal requirements for establishing a land claim in Ector County, Texas. The friend wrote back with the relevant information and a note that said the land near the Rocking H was becoming increasingly valuable and that anyone looking to establish a modest spread in that country was doing so at a good moment. James's letters to Delia in those months were the best letters he had ever written. He told her his plans with the same precision he brought to his geological reports, because she was a person who deserved to know exactly what she was deciding on, and she responded to each detail with a frankness and engagement that confirmed, repeatedly and specifically, that she was choosing him fully informed and with characteristic Delia Hart certainty. She told him she had spoken to Mrs. Harbert about the horse operation, and Mrs. Harbert had agreed immediately and with great enthusiasm, and they had drawn up a formal arrangement in which Delia managed the breeding and training side of the operation in exchange for a wage and a percentage, with the option to purchase a section of land on the ranch's north boundary over the following 5 years at a fair price. "She is giving me a path to my own land," Delia wrote, "not as a gift, as earned. That is the only way I would want it. Mrs. Harbert understands that." James read this in his Austin rooms in the January rain, and thought about the woman who had come to New Mexico territory from Santa Fe after her mother died, and had managed alone and afraid for 2 years, and had refused to ask for anything she had not earned, and he thought about the life they were going to build together in the West Texas plain, and he was so full of something warm and sure that the small Austin room felt about half the size it actually was. He arrived at the Rocking H on the 3rd of February, 1879, 5 days before the wedding, because Delia had asked him to come early enough to meet the minister and handle the various practical arrangements, and also, she had added in a postscript that he had read 4 times, because 3 months is a long time, and I would like to see you before I have to stand in front of everyone and be composed. She met him at the gate when he rode in. No formality this time, just her coming directly across the yard in her work clothes with her hair back and a look on her face that made his heart do the complicated warm thing, and she put her hand up and took his when he reached down for her and said simply, "Hello, James." And he said, "Hello, Delia." And it was as though no time had passed at all, and also as though he had been traveling a very long time and had finally arrived somewhere he was supposed to be. Mrs. Harbert had taken it upon herself to invite what seemed to James a substantial portion of the county. This was not what either he or Delia had anticipated exactly, but Mrs. Harbert was a woman who had lived in this country for 16 years and had built friendships across it with the same care she built everything, and her genuine pleasure in the occasion translated into a guest list of 32 people who arrived over the course of the 8th of February 1879 from varying distances, some of them having ridden 2 days. The minister was a circuit preacher named Willard Hatch, a large, cheerful man who had apparently been marrying and burying the populations of a 6-county circuit for 15 years, and who told James, during the brief private conversation they had the evening before, that in his experience, the best marriages were between 2 people who had already proven they could survive difficult things, because difficult things would continue to occur after the wedding at a rate roughly consistent with their pre-wedding rate. James told him this seemed both statistically sound and somewhat foreboding as premarital counsel. Hatch laughed and slapped him on the shoulder and said that was precisely the spirit. The wedding was on the morning of the 9th of February in the yard of the Rocking H, in cool, clear winter light with the mountains visible to the west as a blue suggestion on the horizon. Mrs. Harbert had overseen the decoration of the yard with dried flowers from her garden and lengths of calico cloth strung between the fence posts, and the overall effect was one of simple, serious beauty, the kind that occurs when people who care deeply about something arrange it with their own hands. Delia came out of the ranch house in a dress she had made herself, dark blue wool with a high collar and small buttons of polished bone, and her hair was pinned up beneath a hat he had not seen before, a simple thing with a single ribbon, and she walked across the yard through the guests toward where James stood with Minister Hatch and Carver Fitch, who was serving as the nearest available equivalent of a witness and best man rolled into one, and she walked without hesitation, because that was who she was. And James watched her come and did not look at anything else. The words they said to each other in front of Minister Hatch were the old traditional words, because both of them were people who thought that things tested by time had earned their place, and the old words for marriage had been tested by a very great deal of human experience and had come through containing something true. When James said "I will," it was the simplest and most completely meant thing he had ever said. When Delia said "I will," her eyes were steady and direct and absolutely certain, and he loved her so specifically and so fully in that moment that he thought the field journal in his coat, with its pressed photograph, might as well be a different artifact from a different world, because the world had opened up from that small image into this living person, this morning, this light. There was a celebration afterward that lasted most of the afternoon and involved more food than the Rocking H had ever produced at one sitting, owing partly to Mrs. Harbert's organizational capacities, and partly to the fact that half the guests had brought contributions, as was the way in ranch country, where a community understood itself as a mutual thing. There was music from a fiddle player from the neighboring ranch who was apparently legendary in the county for his ability to play from early afternoon until the stars were out, and he proved worthy of this reputation. Miguel Reyes danced with a quiet intensity that suggested great practice and greater feeling, and Carver Fitch sat on the porch beside Mrs. Harbert's chair and watched everything with the expression of a man who will not dance under any circumstances, but is privately very glad the dancing is happening. James danced with Delia twice, which was the proper number for 1879 if you wanted to communicate exactly what you were communicating without causing scandal, and the second dance was slow enough that he could talk to her quietly while they moved, and what he said was very quiet and entirely for her, and what she said back was the same, and none of it was available to the historical record, which was exactly right. In the years that followed, James Holloway worked the West Texas survey grid in the spring and summer, and returned to the Rocking H each fall, and the arrangement served them well for 3 years, each reunion as good as the last, each departure harder than it should have been but accepted because both of them were people who understood that work done well had its own integrity that was not negotiable. In the spring of 1880, their first child was born, a boy they named Thomas, after James's father. He arrived in April with the first warm weather, and the particular authority that newborns bring to a household, which is the authority of complete necessity. Delia managed the delivery with the help of a capable midwife from town, and recovered with the efficiency that characterized everything she did, and James came home 3 weeks early from his spring survey to find his wife sitting on the porch with his son in her arms, and the April light turning everything gold and the horses moving in the corrals behind the house. And he stood at the gate for a moment and looked at the picture it made, and thought that there was no image in any field journal that had ever compared to this. Thomas Holloway grew into a sturdy, curious child who followed his father on every available occasion during survey season, demanding explanations for rock formations and bird behaviors, and the operation of surveying equipment with a persistence that James found both exhausting and profoundly satisfying. He had his mother's eyes, dark and direct, and his father's habit of writing things down, which he began doing as soon as Delia taught him his letters. In 1882, Mrs. Harbert, who had been declining gently and gracefully for 2 years, died in her sleep on a September morning, peacefully and in her own bed, which was what she had wanted and what those who loved her had hoped for. She left the Rocking H to Carver Fitch and to Delia in equal shares, with a note that said she could not think of 2 people better suited to continue what she and her husband had built, and that she hoped the ranch would be a source of joy and honest work for a generation yet. Carver Fitch, reading this in the kitchen with Delia and James on the morning the lawyer brought the papers, made no sound for 30 seconds, and then cleared his throat twice with the force of a man preventing several other things from happening, and then excused himself to check on the horses. Delia stood in the kitchen with the papers and tears running quietly down her face, and James put his arm around her and held her, and Thomas, who was 2.5 and did not fully understand grief, but understood that something large and sad was happening to his mother, climbed up from his chair and pressed himself against her legs with the total commitment of a small person offering everything he had, which was himself. "She was a very good woman," Delia said, after a while. "She was," James said. "I want to keep building what she built," Delia said. "That is the best thing I can think of to do for her." "I know," he said, "and you will," she did. In the years following, the horse operation Delia ran became known across 3 counties as a source of reliably good quarter horses, well-tempered and sound, the kind of animals that working ranchers and occasional military buyers came specifically to the Rocking H to find. She had an eye for bloodlines and a patience with the animals that produced horses that trusted people, which was not as common as it should have been and which commanded a premium. By 1883, James had begun winding down his fieldwork seasons. The survey was complete enough in its Texas work that the desk work in Austin was becoming the primary need, and he had spent enough seasons away from the Rocking H that both he and Delia had had extensive private thoughts about whether the next season needed to happen at all. The conversation they finally had about it was in the kitchen in the November of that year, and it was direct and honest and concluded within 20 minutes with the decision that James would take a position as a regional coordinator for the survey, based in Midland, which was close enough to home to ride back on weekends and far enough to be serious work. This arrangement lasted 2 years, and then the survey opened a permanent analytical office in Odessa, and James transferred there, and after that he was home every night, which suited him enormously and which Thomas celebrated by immediately expanding the list of questions he required answered each evening to include everything that had occurred to him during the day in his father's absence. Their second child arrived in 1885, a daughter they named Charlotte after Mrs. Harbord, because there was no other name that felt right. She was born in October with the mesquite trees turning yellow outside the window and the horses calling in the corrals, and she arrived in the world with an expression of profound assessment, as though she were already determining the quality of the situation she had arrived into, which she apparently found satisfactory. She had James's coloring, lighter than her brother, with gray eyes that would later darken to the blue-gray of a winter sky. Carver Fitch, who had continued living and working on the Rocking H in the years after Mrs. Harbord's passing, took to Charlotte with the same dignified reserve with which he took to everything, which meant that he consistently appeared wherever she happened to be, and could frequently be found telling her the names of horses with the gravity of a man who considered this essential education, which he did. In the spring of 1886, 8 years after Delia had ridden into James's survey camp in the canyon country with a wounded man and a paint mare and 2 years of silence between them, James Holloway sat on the porch of the Rocking H in the April evening and watched the horses in the East Corral and took out his field journal to make a note of something geological he had seen that afternoon, a fresh cut in the creek bank that showed an interesting unconformity in the limestone layers. He opened the journal to the back, and the photograph was there, as it had been for 10 years now, the small tintype with the crease down the middle, Delia at 23 against the painted garden backdrop that had never existed, looking straight into the camera with that expression that was warmer than any neutral expression had a right to be. He heard the screen door and then Delia's step on the boards, and she came and sat beside him in the other chair, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and she handed him one and they sat together in the April evening, with the light going golden over the plain, and the horses moving slowly in the corral, and Thomas's voice carrying from inside the house, where he was doing his lessons, with a thoroughness that periodically expressed itself as loud questions about geography. Delia looked at the journal in his lap and the photograph at the back of it. "You still have that," she said. "I will always have it," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he felt her exhale slowly, the complete exhale of a person entirely at ease. And he put his arm around her, and they sat in the April light with the coffee warm in their hands, and the country opening out around them in all directions. The country they both knew and worked and belonged to. The country their children would grow up in, and it was exactly the life they had meant to build. Built honestly and piece by piece, with the patience of people who knew that the best formations took time. From inside, Charlotte, who was 7 months old and had just discovered that she could produce a significant volume of sound when she chose to, demonstrated this discovery with enthusiasm. "She wants feeding," Delia said, without moving. "She wants an audience," James said. "She has your sense of timing." Delia laughed and lifted her head and looked at him with those dark river eyes, and he looked back at her in the April evening with 10 years between them that had held everything. The carrying of a small photograph through every dry season, the riding toward a survey flag in the canyon country, the wound and the records and the federal warrant and the wedding in February light, the son with his father's habits and his mother's eyes, the daughter named for a woman they had both loved. All of it building the way geology builds, layer by patient layer, into something solid and true and worth the time it took. He kissed her once, quietly and completely, and then she stood and went inside to their daughter, and the evening continued in the beautiful and ordinary way of evenings on the rocking H in the spring of 1886, with the horses in the corral and the boy doing his lessons and the woman who had been a photograph, and was now a life moving through the warm rooms of the house they had made together. And James Holloway sat on the porch in the last of the light, and felt the happiness of a man who has kept, through every dry season, the most important thing he ever found, and has had the extraordinary good fortune to find it again, this time in the full and living world. He opened the field journal and looked at the photograph one more time, the crease down the middle, Delia at 23, the expression that was warmer than any neutral expression had a right to be. Then he turned to a fresh page and wrote his geological note, the creek bank, the unconformity in the limestone, the precise language of a man who recorded the world carefully, and he tucked the journal closed with the photograph safe inside it, where it had always been, where it would remain. The stars were beginning above the eastern plain, and the April night was coming on cool and sweet, and from inside the house he could hear Delia's voice now, the specific warm register she used with Charlotte, low and sure and completely devoted, and Thomas's voice answering some question of his own from the table, and the sounds of the life they had made together filled the rocking H from one end of the evening to the other, and James Holloway sat in all of it and was, entirely and specifically and without reservation, exactly where he was supposed to be.